Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
An attempted coup in Benin has been thwarted by rapid action from its West African neighbors, led by Nigeria.
Nigeria came to our aid by conducting strikes at the end of the day with its military aircraft, which immobilized some of the armored vehicles.
At least 9 countries have faced coups in Africa since the COVID pandemic. But after years of inaction by the regional economic bloc, this time the response was much more emphatic.
I would like to commend the sense of duty of our army and its leaders, who remained Republican and loyal to the nation. With them, we stood firm, recaptured our positions, and cleared the last packets of resistance from the mutineers. This treachery will not go unpunished.
On today's episode of the Next Africa podcast, we'll look at what happened in Benin, which other countries could be at risk, and whether the domino of West African coups could be halted. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. Joining us this week is Bloomberg's Katarina Hoije, who is based in West Africa and has written this week's Next Africa newsletter. Katarina, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast again. Katarina, let's start with the weekend's events. Talk us through what exactly happened in Benin and when it became clear that something potentially damaging for the country was happening.
On Sunday morning, for the people in Cotonou, it was probably, when gunfire started as soldiers attacked a military base and raided an arms cache. For the rest of the world, I think it was when they came on state TV saying that they had ousted the president and taken control. Unfortunately, a very familiar picture here in West Africa. The soldiers then managed to actually get close enough to the president's residency for him to witness the clashes firsthand. They also succeeded in kidnapping 2 senior military officers who were only released the next day. But the fact that Talon was never arrested and could get called through to Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu, who before the end of the day sent in the fighter jets that conducted airstrikes against the soldiers. And then that was joined by troops from Ivory Coast, while one of Benin's allies, France, provided intelligence and logistics. I think this was all a much swifter response to a clear coup attempt than we'd seen in the region more often. And, by the end of the day, the soldiers are back in control in Cotonou. We know that they're still chasing down the last mutineers, but basically a botched coup in a few hours.
And we know that, as you were just pointing out there, the response from Ecowas in the past has not been as swift. What changed this time? I mean, you said it was over by the end of the day. That's quite different than what we've seen elsewhere.
Compared to its neighbors, Burkina Faso, Niger, Benin is still seen as quite relatively stable, which gives it more political weight and makes Ecowas more willing to defend an elected government. Also, again, the fact that Talon was not arrested. The other thing is, of course, the fear of Benin joining the Sahel military bloc with Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. It still sort of shows that they still don't know exactly how to handle these coups, because Ecowas in action in Guinea-Bissau last month, where there was a coup, for example, sort of shows that whether they react or not still remains mainly on whether it's politically important to them and not exactly because they're playing by a rule book.
And Katarina, over the past few years, we've reported, as you have too, of the retreat of French troops and France more broadly in the region. Why did they decide to step in here in Benin?
France has remained loyal to Benin or vice versa, unlike countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where we've seen French troops along with its European allies forced to leave. So France providing a bit of logistics support and intelligence, as they confirmed, and as Benin has also confirmed as well, makes sense. Then obviously avoiding sending troops getting in underground, which has proved to be unsuccessful in the past. Benin remains, again, not a huge market for France, but the coastal countries are still where France has their main business interest right now. So defending these countries and preventing a spillover or a bigger spillover of violence from the Sahel is another strategic interest for France. We've also seen France moving closer to Nigeria. President Macron was in Abuja as late as September. So again, that backing a new ally in the region could also have been motivation for France to react in this case.
Which, of course, brings up President Tinubu, because you pointed out the crucial role that Nigeria played. How do you read into his response and his role in this whole scenario?
I mean, Nigeria moved fast for its own interests. Benin is vital to Nigeria's economy. The port in Cotonou is important for trade and movement of goods. It's close to Nigeria's biggest city, Lagos, which is then also the commercial capital. Secondly, there's the security spillover. Risks were high in this case. Al-Qaeda militants have recently crossed from Benin into Nigeria, sort of making a stable Benin more important for Tinubu. I think there's also some personal motivations here. It was sort of a chance for him to show that he has a strong role regionally. In 2023, he tried to react against the coup in neighboring Niger, but because it was too slow, Tinubu had just come to power. When Nigeria and the regional bloc finally reacted, the coup was already completed. So this was maybe a way of him to rectifying that image.
And we've talked about just how concerning some parts of Nigeria are, just given some of the militants and the Islamist militants and the threat that they pose. Do you think he was maybe trying to send a message to his electorate that he is taking a stand?
Well, I mean, if he was doing that, he would have maybe reacted in Nigeria. The country has seen a spike in militant activity with mass abductions and attacks against civilians. Only last month, gunmen attacked a church, killing a pastor and worshippers, and days later, maybe even more significant, more than 300 students and teachers were kidnapped from a boarding school. I mean, President Tinubu has reacted by naming a new defense chief, but hasn't actually been able to stop these attacks. And he's also become under pressure from US President Trump, who has warned that Christianity in Nigeria faces an existential threat, and threatening to cut aid and even intervene militarily. So I'm thinking that Nigerians are probably wondering, if we can send fighter jets to Benin, why can't we do the same in our country?
Absolutely. Stick with me, Katarina. When we come back, we'll broaden the conversation out from Nigeria and talk about some of the other states in the region that are potentially nervous about potential coups in the future and what that might mean for 2026. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today on the podcast, we're digging into the attempted coup in Benin and what it means for democratic governments in West Africa. Our reporter, Katarina Hoije, is still with me. So, Katarina, you wrote in the newsletter this week about the 8 coups that have taken place in Africa since 2020. You briefly touched on it before, but how do you assess the reason why there's been so many over the past just 5 years?
I mean, they're all taking place in sort of like a regional context of insecurity and often fragile leadership, with violence, especially from the Sahel states, spreading into West African coastal countries here. I think Benin, it's already been the deadliest year yet with attacks from militants. Violence has surged with fatalities reaching nearly 70% increase. There's also a discontent with political elites, leaders who've been elected more or less fairly and then failed to actually improve lives for the citizens. Again, in Benin, we heard the military speak about the lack of development. They mentioned education and also economic mismanagement. And that is something that we've seen across the board, and which is very vivid among large growing young populations that are struggling to find jobs and, make a living for themselves. Then again, I mean, absolutely there's the regional and local differences, but I think these sort of main factors is what's been driving coups in recent years.
There's plenty of states that are likely looking to the situation in Benin and wondering what that could mean for them. Of course, earlier this year, we did see Madagascar with a similar situation. Are there any other states in West Africa that you think potentially are in a position to be vulnerable to coups?
I think without naming any names, anywhere where leaders have extended their power, either by changing constitutions or by preventing opponents from running in elections, then we can mention Ivory Coast and Togo. There is a risk, and this is again paired with, big young populations that are demanding better opportunities, along with Islamist violence in some of these states. So I think any country that are seeing this play out is at risk, is more vulnerable to a coup, to say.
And that's becoming even increasing in the number of states that we see across the continent. What are you paying attention to next, Katarina, just given this latest incident in Benin?
I think what's going to be interesting to look at is, of course, there's elections coming up in Benin next year, and Talon has done exactly what I mentioned that he probably shouldn't be doing. He has been sidelining political opponents, and he's now paving the way for his successor, Finance Minister Romuald Wadagni, to take over power. While Wadagni is a great technocrat who's been hailed as the man behind Benin's economic success, he might not have the same credentials or political ideas as Talon has, so that's definitely a risk. And then I'll be looking at neighboring countries. We have Togo that's seen protests since President Faure Gnassingbé extended his rule there earlier this year. So that's definitely what we're looking at. And again, the security issues. The triangle with Niger, Benin, Nigeria is seeing a spread of Islamist violence. Again, I would say fertile ground for violence and coups.
Katarina, thanks again so much for joining us today. And you can read Katarina's reporting from West Africa, including her recent newsletter, on Bloomberg platforms now. Here's some of the other stories we've been following across the region this week. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer says he is happy to consider removing South Africa from the list of African nations that receives duty-free access, known as AGOA, to the American economy. And the streets of Tanzania's biggest city, Dar es Salaam, were deserted this week as residents heeded government orders to remain indoors to avoid arrest, a sign the state's bloody crackdown may have deterred protesters. Marches have been planned across the East African nation to mark the 64th anniversary of independence from the UK. The government, though, canceled official celebrations in anticipation of the demonstrations. And you can follow these stories across Bloomberg, including the Next Africa newsletter. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley and Tiwa Adebayo. Don't forget to follow and review this show wherever you usually get your podcasts. But for now, I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks as always for listening.